I thought I was watching my son become valedictorian, but his graduation speech turned into a live public execution of our family's darkest secrets. Before the music stopped, my socialite wife was exposed as a kidnapper, and a woman missing for 19 years walked down the aisle to reclaim her life. The sun was beating down on the manicured turf of St. Jude's Academy, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and your Sunday best feel like a lead suit. I sat in the third row of the VIP section, my hands tucked between my knees to hide the fact that they were shaking. To my left sat Elena, my ex-wife, looking like she had stepped straight out of a high-fashion magazine. Her ice blue dress was perfectly pressed, her hair was a sculpted masterpiece of platinum blonde, and her expression was one of practiced, regal indifference. To anyone else, we looked like the picture of success, the wealthy architect and his socialite ex-wife coming together to celebrate their son, Leo, the valedictorian. But if you looked closer, you'd see the space between us wasn't just a few inches of plastic seating. It was a canyon filled with 20 years of resentment and a secret that had finally, inevitably, caught fire. The atmosphere in the stadium was suffocating, and it wasn't just the humidity. Usually at these ceremonies, there's a low hum of excited chatter, the sound of programs being used as fans, and the occasional cry of a toddler. But today, the silence was heavy. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. When we had walked to our seats, the other parents hadn't greeted Elena with their usual fawning smiles. Instead, they had stared. Some whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting from Elena to the giant LED screens flanking the stage. Others looked away entirely, pulling their children closer as if scandal were a contagious disease. Elena, of course, acted like she didn't notice. She held her chin high, her gaze fixed on the empty podium. "They're just jealous, David," she had hissed into my ear as we sat down. "They've always hated that we're the golden family of this district. Let them gawk. By tomorrow, they'll be begging for invites to my summer gala again." I didn't have the heart to tell her that there would be no summer gala. I didn't have the heart to tell her that the golden family had turned to lead overnight. Leo was already backstage, preparing his valedictory address. I hadn't seen him since the previous night, the night everything shattered. He had come to my small apartment, his face pale, holding a laptop like it was a live grenade. He didn't say much, he just played the files. By the time the last video ended, I was sick to my stomach, and Leo was vibrating with a cold, hard rage I hadn't known he possessed. "I have to do it, Dad," he had said, his voice cracking. "I can't walk across that stage and pretend my life is a lie just so she can keep her reputation." I had tried to talk him out of it, not to protect Elena, but to protect him. I knew how she played. I knew that if he crossed her, she wouldn't just be angry, she would be scorched earth. But Leo had his mother's stubbornness and my sense of justice, a volatile combination that led us here, to this sun-drenched field where 1,000 people were waiting for the execution. The processional music began, the familiar, slow thrum of pomp and circumstance. A line of blue robes appeared at the edge of the field. I searched the faces until I saw him. Leo. He looked older than 18. He looked like a man walking toward a fight he knew he might lose. He didn't look at us as he marched past. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw set. Elena leaned forward, a tight theatrical smile appearing on her face for the benefit of the cameras. "Look at him, David. My masterpiece. I spent 18 years molding him for this moment. He's going to go to Yale, he's going to take over the firm, and he's going to ensure our name stays at the top of the masthead." "He's a human being, Elena," I whispered, "not a project." She scoffed, the sound sharp as a razor. "He is a reflection of me, and I don't allow my reflections to be anything less than perfect." The ceremony moved in a blur. Speeches from the principal, the dean, a local senator. It was all white noise. I kept looking at the audience. The whispering had started again, more frantic now. People were looking at their phones, then looking back at Elena. The golden mother of the community was being dissected in real time on social media, and she was the only one who didn't realize the scalpel was already in. Finally, the principal stood at the microphone. And now, to deliver the valedictory address, please welcome the top student of the class of 2024, Leo Sterling. The applause was strange. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic clapping of a graduation. It was loud, intense, and filled with a frantic energy. It was the sound of a crowd that knew a bomb was about to go off and couldn't wait for the explosion. Leo stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, his hands steady now. He looked out over his peers, then at the teachers, and finally he turned his head slowly to look directly at the VIP section, directly at his mother. Elena beamed, clapping delicately, her eyes shining with what looked like pride, but was actually just the satisfaction of ownership. "Thank you, Principal Miller," Leo began, his voice echoing through the stadium speakers. "Standing here today, I'm supposed to talk about our future. I'm supposed to talk about the Sterling legacy and the doors that have been opened for us by our prestigious families. I'm supposed to thank my parents for their unwavering support and the moral compass they've provided." He paused. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the wind whistling through the stadium rafters. "But I can't do that," Leo continued, his voice dropping an octave, "because the Sterling legacy is built on a foundation of lies, and the woman who claims to be my moral compass is actually the person who taught me that truth is a commodity to be bought, sold, and buried." Beside me, Elena's smile didn't just fade, it vanished. Her face went gray, her features sharpening into a mask of pure venom. She didn't look at the stage anymore. She looked at the crowd, realizing for the first time that they weren't admiring her. They were watching her fall. "Leo," she hissed, though her voice carried only to me. "What is he doing? Shut him up." But Leo wasn't done. He reached into the pocket of his graduation robe and pulled out a small, high-capacity USB drive. He held it up for the entire stadium to see. "Last night," Leo said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and adrenaline, "I found the digital records my mother thought she had deleted 5 years ago. Records that explain exactly how our family's construction firm secured the contracts for this very school and why the St. Jude Scholarship Fund is currently empty." The audience gasped in unison, a sound like a giant intake of breath. Elena stood up. She didn't look like a socialite anymore. She looked like a predator backed into a corner. She didn't care about the cameras or the 1,000 witnesses. She walked to the edge of the VIP barricade, her finger pointed at her son like a loaded gun. "Sit down, Leo," she screamed, her voice cracking across the quiet field. "I am your mother. I gave you everything. If you say one more word, I will strip you of every cent, every connection, and every bit of help you've ever had. I will disown you right here in front of everyone." Leo looked down at her from the podium, a sad, knowing smile on his face. He didn't look afraid. He looked free. "You're too late, Mom," Leo said into the microphone. "Everyone already knows." As he spoke, the giant LED screens behind him flickered. They weren't showing the live feed of the graduation anymore. Instead, a document began to scroll, a list of bank transfers, offshore accounts, and a series of emails with Elena's digital signature. Elena turned, seeing her private crimes broadcast in 50-foot-tall letters. She let out a sound that wasn't human, a raw, guttural shriek of fury. She turned back to Leo, her face contorted. "You are no son of mine," she shrieked, the microphone near the stage picking up her voice for the whole world to hear. "I disown you. You're nothing. You hear me? You're a penniless nobody." She expected him to crumble. She expected him to beg, but Leo didn't move. He just looked at her with pity. "I know," Leo whispered, "but there's one more thing you should know, Elena. Something the audience hasn't seen yet." Leo leaned back into the microphone, his eyes locking onto mine for a split second before he addressed the crowd one last time. "My mother just disowned me for telling the truth," Leo said. "But the reason she's so terrified isn't just the money. It's because of who is standing at the back of this stadium right now." I turned around, following Leo's gaze toward the stadium entrance. My heart stopped. Two men in dark suits were walking down the aisle, but they weren't the police. Behind them stood a woman I hadn't seen in 18 years, a woman who looked exactly like Leo, and who had a legal team following her like a small army. The woman walking down the center aisle didn't need an introduction. Her face was a mirror of Leo's, the same high cheekbones, the same piercing gray eyes, even the same slight tilt to her chin when she was determined. As she drew closer, the gasps from the audience grew into a roar of hushed, frantic conversations. On the giant screens, the scrolling financial documents had been replaced by a side-by-side comparison, a missing persons report from 19 years ago, and a current photograph of the woman now walking toward us. The headline on the screen in bold, stark letters read, "The Stolen Heir. Where is Claire Vance?" Elena's hand flew to her throat, her manicured nails digging into her skin. The regal, untouchable socialite was gone. In her place was a woman who looked like she was seeing a ghost rise from the grave. She began to tremble, not with grief, but with the visceral, shaking terror of a criminal who realizes the exit is locked. "No," Elena whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass. "She's dead. She was supposed to be dead." I stood up, my knees nearly buckling. Claire Vance. The name hit me like a physical blow. 19 years ago, Claire had been Elena's closest friend, her shadow, her assistant, and then one day she was just gone. Elena had told me Claire had suffered a breakdown after a tragic accident and had moved back to her home country to live in a private facility. I had been young, blinded by Elena's charisma and the sudden whirlwind joy of Leo's arrival. We had been using a surrogate, Elena had claimed, a private, closed arrangement. I never saw the surrogate. I never saw the birth. I only saw the baby Elena brought home in a lace-trimmed blanket. The audience wasn't just watching a drama. They were watching a live autopsy of a family. Phones were held high, recording every second. The reason the audience knew was now glaringly obvious on the screens behind Leo. He had leaked the entire dossier to the school's internal network and every local news outlet 5 minutes before he took the stage. The Golden family was being exposed as a kidnapping syndicate. Claire Vance stopped at the edge of the VIP section. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at Leo. A single tear tracked through the light dust on her cheek. "Leo!" she breathed. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the amplified silence of the stadium, it felt like thunder. "Don't you dare!" Elena screamed, lunging forward toward the barricade. She looked feral, her hair falling out of its perfect sculpture. "You signed the papers. You took the money. You gave him to me." "I never signed anything, Elena," Claire said, her voice gaining strength. She looked at the crowd, then at the two men in suits, her lawyers. "I was told my son died in the delivery room. I was told he was stillborn. I was drugged, dumped at a facility under a false name, and left to rot while you played mother with my child." The crowd erupted. It wasn't applause anymore. It was a riotous outpouring of shock and fury. People were standing on their chairs, shouting at Elena. The security guards at the front of the stage looked paralyzed, unsure of whether to protect the valedictorian or the woman screaming at him. Leo stepped down from the podium, his blue robe fluttering behind him. He walked past the principal, who was staring at him in sheer horror, and stood at the very edge of the stage, looking down at the two women who claimed him. "You disowned me, Elena," Leo said, his voice echoing through the speakers. "You said I was nothing without your name, but the truth is, your name is a curse. Everything I have, every grade, every award, every ounce of my character, I achieved despite you, not because of you." He turned his gaze to Claire. The hardness in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. a flicker of the little boy who had always felt like he didn't quite belong in the Sterling mansion. "I found her, Dad," Leo said, looking at me. "I found the hospital records you weren't allowed to see. I found the payments to the doctors who lied to you." I felt the world tilting. I had spent 18 years believing I was a father to a son born of a quiet, clinical arrangement. I had loved Leo with every fiber of my being, but I had always felt a wall between us, a wall built by Elena's constant manipulations. Now I realized that wall was made of the bones of a woman's life. "David, don't listen to him." Elena turned to me, grabbing my arm. Her eyes were wide, manic. "He's doing this to hurt me because I wouldn't let him go to that art school in Europe. He's making it up. It's all a deep fake. Those documents on the screen, he's a genius with computers. He forged them." "The DNA test results are on page 12 of the digital file, Elena," Leo said coldly. "Direct from the lab. There is a 99.9% match between Claire Vance and me, and a 0% match between you and me." Elena let out a choked sound, a mix of a sob and a snarl. She looked around at the sea of faces. The parents she had looked down on, the teachers she had bribed, the community she had ruled with an iron fist. They were all looking at her with a disgust so pure it seemed to physically push her back. She turned back to the stage, her face hardening into something truly terrifying. "Fine," she spat, her voice no longer a scream but a low, poisonous hiss. "You want the truth? You want your real mother? Take her. Take the woman who was too weak to even keep track of her own child. But you forget one thing, Leo. You think you're a hero? You think you're the whistleblower?" She laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "You didn't just leak my bank accounts, you little fool," Elena said, pointing at the screen where the documents were still scrolling. "Look at the transfer from 3 years ago, the one labeled Project Phoenix. Go on, look at it." Leo frowned, turning to look at the screen. He scrolled through the files using a remote in his hand. He found the entry. His face went from triumphant to confused, and then slowly to a mask of absolute horror. I looked at the screen too. It was a wire transfer for $5 million. It wasn't sent to a school or a contractor. It was sent to a private security firm in Eastern Europe. And the memo attached to the payment was a single sentence: "Finalize the removal of the witness in the 2005 case." The stadium went cold. The 2005 case wasn't about Claire. It was about the death of the county prosecutor who had been investigating the Sterling firm before his car accidentally went over a bridge. "You didn't just expose me for being a bad mother, Leo," Elena whispered, her eyes gleaming with a sick, terminal triumph. "You just admitted into evidence that you used your father's private login to authorize a hit. You're not the victim here. You're my accomplice." The two men in suits, the ones I thought were Claire's lawyers, suddenly moved. But they didn't go toward Elena. They stepped onto the stage and grabbed Leo by his arms. "Leo Sterling," one of them said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." Leo looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. Dad, I just used the password she gave me. I didn't know." But as the cuffs clicked shut, I saw Elena's hand slip into her purse. She wasn't looking at Leo anymore. She was looking at me, and her hand was tightening around something heavy and metallic. The click of the handcuffs was a sound that shouldn't have existed in the sunshine of a high school graduation. It was a cold, mechanical snap that severed Leo from his future, his dignity, and his safety. The audience, which had been a boiling cauldron of noise just seconds before, went deathly silent. Every eye was fixed on the stage, where the valedictorian of St. Jude's Academy stood in his blue silk robes, his wrists bound behind his back by two men who looked less like police officers and more like soldiers in cheap suits. "Wait!" I screamed. Finally finding my voice, I surged forward, pushing past the rows of horrified parents. "He's 18! He was 15 when that transfer happened. He didn't even have access to those accounts. Elena didn't move. She stood like a statue of ice, her hand still deep inside her designer purse. As I approached the barrier, she turned her head toward me. Her eyes were devoid of everything: love, regret, even anger. There was only a terrifying, hollow vacuum. "He had the password, David," she said, her voice eerily calm over the din of the wind and the distant sirens. "I gave it to him for his educational investments. I didn't know he was using it to clean up the mess he made after he ran that prosecutor off the road." "That's a lie," Leo shouted, his voice cracking. He was struggling against the two men, his graduation cap falling off and tumbling into the dirt. "I wasn't even driving that night. You were. You told me we hit a deer. You told me to forget it ever happened." One of the men in suits jerked Leo's arm, forcing him toward the stairs. "Save it for the station, kid." Claire Vance moved then. She didn't go for Elena. She went for the men holding Leo. "Let him go," she cried, her voice a raw, jagged edge of maternal instinct. "You've stolen 19 years of my life. You will not take his too." She threw herself at the taller man, but he didn't even flinch. He shoved her back with a brutal, practiced efficiency that sent her sprawling into the front row of folding chairs. The crowd gasped, a collective sound of pure horror. I reached the stage, my hands gripping the edge of the wood. I looked up at Leo, whose face was a mask of betrayal. Then I looked at the men. Something was wrong. They weren't wearing badges. They didn't have radios, and their holsters weren't standard-issue police gear. "They aren't cops, Leo," I yelled. "They're hers." The man holding Leo didn't wait. He didn't try to explain. He reached into his jacket, but he wasn't pulling out a badge. He was pulling out a suppressed pistol. He didn't point it at the crowd. He pointed it at the ground near Claire's feet, a silent, deadly warning. "Everyone stay back," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "This is a high-priority transport. Interference will be met with lethal force." Elena finally pulled her hand out of her purse. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding a small, black remote with a single red button. She looked at me, then at the giant LED screens that were still displaying the evidence of her crimes. "You think you won, David," she whispered, loud enough only for me to hear. "You think you can just bring a ghost back from the dead and tear down everything I built? I am the Sterling name. I am the foundation of this city. If I go down, I'm taking the whole damn sky with me." She pressed the button. A deafening crack echoed through the stadium, but it wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of the massive lighting rigs above the stage snapping. The heavy metal beams, laden with thousands of pounds of equipment, began to groan. A cable snapped with the sound of a whip, lashing across the stage and narrowly missing the principal, who dove for cover. Chaos erupted. 1,000 people began to scream at once, a tidal wave of panic as the crowd realized the structure was failing. People trampled over chairs, parents grabbed their children, and the faculty scrambled for the exits. In the middle of the carnage, the officers began dragging Leo toward the back of the stage, where a black SUV had just jumped the curb and was racing across the grass toward them. "Leo!" I jumped onto the stage, ignoring the groaning metal above me. I tackled the man holding Leo's left arm. We went down hard, the smell of expensive cologne and gun oil filling my nose. I swung a fist, landing a desperate, clumsy blow against his jaw. "Get him to the car!" the other man yelled, dragging Leo away. I tried to stand, but a heavy heel slammed into my ribs. I looked up to see Elena standing over me, her face illuminated by the flickering, dying light of the LED screens. The documents she had worked so hard to hide were still scrolling, a digital confession that no one was watching anymore. "You were always too soft, David," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You thought our marriage was about love. It was about legacy. And if the legacy is broken, I have no use for the pieces." She looked toward the SUV. The door was open. They were forcing Leo inside. He was fighting, kicking, his blue robe shredded, his eyes locked on mine. "Dad, help me!" But Elena wasn't looking at the car. She was looking at the woman who had just crawled back to her feet. Claire Vance was standing near the podium, her eyes burning with a fire that 19 years of darkness hadn't been able to extinguish. Claire grabbed the heavy brass award Leo had won earlier, the valedictorian trophy, and began to move toward Elena. "You took my son," Claire said, her voice shaking the very air. "You took my life. You will never touch him again." Elena laughed, a sharp, manic sound that was drowned out by the scream of another snapping cable. "He's already gone, Claire. By the time you find him, he'll be just like that prosecutor, a tragic memory on a dark road." The lighting rig tilted precariously. A massive speaker cabinet broke free, crashing onto the stage floor just inches from where I lay. The entire structure was coming down. "The SUV!" Claire screamed, pointing past Elena. I turned my head. The black SUV wasn't driving away. A second vehicle, an unmarked white van, had slammed into its side, T-boning it right there on the 50-yard line. The impact was violent, glass spraying across the turf like diamonds. The doors of the white van slid open. 4 people jumped out wearing tactical gear, but they didn't have police on their backs. They had a logo I recognized. The logo of a private investigative firm I had hired months ago, the one I told Leo I had given up on. But they weren't looking for Leo. They were looking for the driver of the SUV. The driver's side door of the wrecked SUV creaked open. A man crawled out, blood streaming down his face. Even through the blood and the distance, I knew that face. It was the face of the man who had supposedly died in the car accident with the prosecutor 3 years ago. The dead witness was alive. Elena's face went from triumph to a mask of absolute paralyzing horror. She looked at the man crawling on the grass, then at the remote in her hand. "How?" she whispered. "He was handled. I paid for it." "You paid the wrong people, Elena," I said, gasping for air as I stood up. "I didn't just hire investigators to find Claire. I hired them to find the money." Suddenly, the stadium's PA system, which had been dead since the rig started collapsing, hissed to life. But it wasn't Leo's voice. It was a recording. "The boy doesn't matter, Elena. Just make sure the father's login is used. If we need a fall guy, it's better if it's the son. He's young, he'll get a lighter sentence, and it keeps your hands clean." It was Elena's voice, and the man she was talking to was the very man now crawling away from the wreckage on the field. Elena froze. She looked at the remote in her hand, then at the crowd, which had stopped running and was now staring at the speakers in stunned silence. She looked at me, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "I still have the codes," she hissed, her thumb hovering over the red button again. "You think this is the only thing I rigged? This entire school was built by my firm, David. Every beam, every floor, every emergency exit." She smiled, a slow, terrifying grin that told me she had one more card to play, one that involved more than just a falling light rig. "If I'm going to prison," Elena whispered, "none of these perfect families are going home today." She pressed the button a second time, and a deep, rhythmic thud began to vibrate through the earth beneath our feet, coming from the direction of the school's main building. "Leo!" I screamed, turning toward the SUV. But as I turned, I saw something that stopped my heart. Leo wasn't in the SUV anymore. He had been pulled out during the crash, but he wasn't with my investigators. He was being held by a third group, people who had emerged from the shadows of the stadium tunnel, wearing the uniforms of the state police, and they weren't pointing their guns at Elena. They were pointing them at me. The barrels of the rifles were steady, cold, and aimed directly at my chest. The state police didn't look like they were here to celebrate a graduation. They looked like they were here to stop a terrorist. "Hands behind your head! Interlace your fingers!" the lead officer screamed. I did as I was told, my knees hitting the vibrating plywood of the stage. The rhythmic thudding from beneath us was getting louder, a deep mechanical pulse that seemed to be coming from the very bowels of the earth. Next to me, Elena had collapsed into a heap of theatrical sobs, her ice blue dress splayed out like a fallen flag. "Thank God you're here," she wailed, her voice high and piercing. "He's been holding us hostage. My husband, David, he's the one who authorized the hit on the prosecutor. He used our son to do it. He's been threatening to blow up the school if I didn't give him control of the firm." I looked at her in stunned silence. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. But then I looked at the giant LED screens behind us. The scrolling documents had changed. They weren't showing Elena's bank transfers anymore. They were showing my private emails. My digital signature was at the bottom of a dozen incriminating files: orders for substandard steel, payments to offshore hitmen, and a series of messages to Leo instructing him on how to handle the witness. She hadn't just been hiding her crimes, she had been meticulously building a mirror of them in my name. For 3 years, every move she made through my accounts. She hadn't been avoiding the light, she had been preparing to throw me into it. "That's a lie," Leo shouted from the back of the stage, where the other officers were holding him. "I have the source code. I can prove it's a spoof." "Shut up, kid," the officer snarled, jerking Leo's arm. The audience, which had been a sea of panic, suddenly went still. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of a jury. They looked from the screen to me, then back to the screen. The reason the audience had been staring at us when we arrived wasn't just because of the leaks. It was because the news had been breaking on their phones for the last hour. To them, I wasn't the grieving father. I was the mastermind. But then, Claire Vance stepped forward. She didn't look at the police. She didn't look at me. She walked straight to the edge of the stage, overlooking the crowd. "You all know the truth," she shouted, her voice amplified by the still active podium microphone. "You aren't silent because you believe her lies. You're silent because you're on the list. How many of you in the second row bought your daughters? How many of you in the VIP section paid Elena to find you a son when the adoption agencies said no?" The stadium turned into a vacuum. The parents who had been screaming for the exits suddenly stopped. They looked at each other, their faces pale and masks of guilt finally slipping. This was the dark heart of St. Jude's Academy. It wasn't just a school for the elite. It was a clearinghouse for a human trafficking ring masked as a private surrogacy network. Elena wasn't just a socialite, she was their provider. If I went down, their secrets went down with me. If Elena went down, she was taking every golden family in the county with her. "Officer, arrest them!" a man shouted from the front row, a prominent judge. "They're clearly deranged. Protect Mrs. Sterling." The lead officer hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and the screaming crowd. But the ground didn't wait for his decision. A massive crack ripped through the center of the football field. A fissure 3 feet wide opened in the turf, swallowing the white yard lines. The rhythmic thudding reached a crescendo, and suddenly a geyser of muddy water and steam erupted from the hole. "The water main!" someone yelled. "The foundation is giving way." The Golden School was built on a lie, and the lie was finally collapsing. The stadium's north stand began to tilt, the metal screaming as it twisted. The police officers panicked, their training failing in the face of a literal earthquake. They scrambled for the stairs, momentarily releasing their grip on Leo. "Leo, run!" I lunged toward him, but the stage beneath me buckled. I fell, my shoulders slamming into the podium. As I looked up, I saw Elena. She wasn't crying anymore. She had stopped the act the moment the police turned their backs. She was standing at the very edge of the stage, looking down into the fissure. A man was climbing out of the hole. He was covered in mud and grease, his clothes rags, but his face, I knew that face. He was the dead witness, the one from the SUV crash. But there was someone else behind him. Another man, older, dressed in a pristine gray suit that seemed untouched by the chaos. The man in the suit stepped onto the stage with a grace that was terrifying. He looked at Elena, and for the first time in 20 years, I saw her look truly, deeply afraid. Not the fake fear she showed the police, but the soul-crushing terror of a servant facing a master. "You were supposed to keep the site clean, Elena," the man said. His voice was smooth, like aged bourbon, and it carried over the roar of the water. I recognized that voice. It was the voice from the recordings Leo had found, the one who told her to use my login. The man turned his gaze to me. His eyes were a piercing, familiar gray, the same gray as Leo's, the same gray as mine. "David," the man said, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips, "you always were the disappointment of the family. I should have known you'd let a child ruin 20 years of work." "Who are you?" I gasped, my chest tightening. The man stepped closer, ignoring the police who were now trying to regroup. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold signet ring, the same one my father had worn until the day he died in a house fire when I was 10. "The sterling legacy isn't yours, David," the man whispered, leaning down so only I could hear him. "It never was. You were just the placeholder until the boy was ready." He turned to Leo, who was standing frozen at the back of the stage. "Come here, Leo," the man said, extending a hand. "It's time to go home. Your real father has been waiting a long time to meet you." I looked at the man, then at my son, then at Claire, who had gone dead silent, her eyes wide with a horror I couldn't understand. "David," Claire whispered, her voice trembling, "that's not your father. That's the man who killed him." Before I could process the words, the man in the suit looked at the dead witness and nodded. The witness reached into his rags and pulled out a detonator. "Goodbye, David," the man in the suit said. He pressed the button, but it wasn't the stadium that exploded. It was the school building behind us. And as the fireball rose into the sky, I saw Leo, my son, take the man's hand and walk toward the flames. The roar of the explosion at the school building was followed by a silence so profound it felt as if the world had run out of oxygen. A plume of black smoke, thick with the scent of burning chemicals and old paper, billowed into the sapphire sky. The stadium lights, already precariously balanced, finally gave way, crashing into the empty bleachers with a sound like 1,000 gongs. Julian, the man who had stolen my father's name and my son's birthright, didn't even flinch. He kept his hand firmly on Leo's shoulder, guiding him toward the smoke, as if leading him into a bright future. "Leo, no!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. My ears were ringing and my vision was blurred by the haze, but I could see the silhouette of my son. He didn't look back. He walked with a stiff, mechanical gait. "It's no use, David," Elena whispered. She was sitting on the edge of the stage, her ice-blue dress stained with mud and ash. She looked at the burning school with a strange, hollow fascination. "Julian always gets what he wants. He's the one who funded the firm. He's the one who selected Claire. He's the one who decided you weren't enough to carry the name." I looked at the audience, the parents of St. Jude's, the judges, the CEOs, the community leaders were no longer fleeing. They stood frozen, staring at Julian. Now I understood the reason they had been so quiet, why they had looked at us with such complicated dread. They weren't just witnesses, they were stakeholders. This school, this golden legacy, was a pyramid scheme of human lives, and Julian was the man at the top. Every one of them owed him a child, a career, or a secret buried in a shallow grave. "He's taking him to the helicopter on the roof," Claire cried out, pointing toward the burning building. She grabbed my arm, her eyes fierce. "David, we have to move. Now!" We jumped from the stage, running across the fractured turf. The state police who had held Leo were nowhere to be seen. They had vanished into the smoke the moment the detonator was pressed. We were alone in the wreckage of our lives. We reached the school's rear entrance just as the secondary alarms began to wail. The heat was blistering. We fought through the service stairwell, the air growing thinner with every floor. When we finally burst onto the roof, the wind from the helicopter's rotors nearly knocked us back. Julian was there, standing at the edge of the helipad. He had a hand on the small of Leo's back, ushering him toward the open door of a sleek, black transport. "Stop!" I bellowed over the roar of the engines. Julian turned. He looked at me with a tired sort of pity. "Go back to your ruins, David. You were a good placeholder. You raised him well. He's disciplined, brilliant, and now he's been properly tempered by the truth. He's ready to lead the Sterling group." "He's not a Sterling," Claire screamed, stepping forward into the light. "He's a Vance, and he's my son." Julian laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Biology is a hobby, Claire. Legacy is a religion. Leo knows where he belongs. Don't you, Leo?" Leo, who had been standing with his back to us, finally turned around. In the flickering light of the fires below, his face looked like cold marble. He reached into the pocket of his torn graduation robe and pulled out a small black object. It wasn't a weapon. It was the microphone from the podium, still connected to the stadium's backup wireless receiver. "You're right about one thing, Julian," Leo said. His voice was projected across the entire stadium, echoing off the surrounding hills, amplified by the emergency speakers that hadn't been destroyed. "I am ready." Leo looked directly into the camera mounted on the helicopter's tail, a camera that was live streaming the official graduation footage to the school's alumni network. "The reason my mother disowned me today wasn't because I'm a liar," Leo told the world. "She disowned me because I'm the only Sterling who refused to be a ghost. And the reason this audience stayed silent is because you're all afraid of this man." Leo pointed at Julian. "But you don't have to be afraid anymore," Leo continued, "because the Project Phoenix files weren't just bank transfers. They were the GPS coordinates for every offshore facility, every hidden nursery, and every private vault this family owns. And I didn't just leak them to the press." Julian's smile faltered. "What did you do, boy?" "I sent them to the one group you couldn't bribe," Leo said, "the International Criminal Court. And I sent them using your personal encryption key, the one you just used to trigger the school's security explosives." For the first time, I saw Julian's mask slip. He lunged for Leo, but Leo was faster. He stepped back toward the edge of the roof, holding up his smartphone. "I've been recording since the moment you stepped onto that stage," Leo said. "The world just heard you admit to killing the prosecutor. They heard you admit to the trafficking. They heard you admit to everything." In the distance, the sound of sirens changed. It wasn't the local police anymore. It was the rhythmic, heavy thrum of multi-agency tactical helicopters. Searchlights cut through the smoke, pinning Julian and his helicopter in beams of blinding white light. "Drop the phone, Leo," Julian hissed, reaching into his coat, but he never got the chance. Claire moved with a speed born of 19 years of stolen time. She tackled Julian, not with a weapon, but with the pure, kinetic force of a mother's rage. They went down near the edge of the roof. The dead witness, the man from the SUV, suddenly appeared from the stairwell, but he wasn't looking to fight. He saw the tactical teams rappelling from the sky and realized the game was over. He turned and ran, disappearing into the smoke. I grabbed Leo, pulling him away from the edge, shielding him as the federal teams swarmed the roof. "I've got you," I whispered, holding him so tight I could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. "I've got you, Leo." "I know, Dad," he gasped, finally breaking. The cold valedictorian mask shattered, and he was just my son again, sobbing into my shoulder. I had to make him talk. I had to make sure he couldn't hide behind the lawyers. Down on the field, Elena was being led away in handcuffs. She didn't look at the cameras anymore. She looked small, withered, and utterly alone. The parents in the audience were being herded into groups, their names being called out by officers with clipboards. The Golden District was being dismantled, brick by crooked brick. Julian was pinned to the roof by 4 tactical officers. As they dragged him away, he looked at me. his eyes full of a hateful, impotent fire. "You've destroyed it all," he spat. "The name, the wealth, the future. You're nothing now." I looked at Claire, who was standing by Leo's side, her hand resting on his shoulder. I looked at my son, who had risked everything to do what I hadn't been strong enough to do 20 years ago. "No, Julian," I said, my voice steady. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be." 1 week later, the stadium was a restricted crime scene, and St. Jude's Academy had been permanently shuttered. The scandal was the largest in the state's history, reaching into the highest levels of government. Claire, Leo, and I sat on the porch of a small house near the coast, far away from the sterling name and the whispers of the elite. We had a long road ahead of us, legal battles, therapy, and the slow process of building a relationship that had been stolen by a madwoman's ambition. Leo sat between us, looking out at the ocean. He held his graduation diploma, the real one, the one Claire had insisted on framing. "So," I said, breaking the quiet, "no Yale? No taking over the firm?" Leo smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that I hadn't seen in years. "I think I've had enough of legacy for one lifetime, Dad. I heard there's a small art school in Europe that doesn't care about your last name, just your talent." "I think that sounds perfect," Claire said, taking his hand. We weren't the golden family anymore. We were broken, scarred, and starting from zero. But as the sun set over the water, for the first time in 18 years, the truth didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like home.